Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our regular Thursday live stream. We have a great one in store for you today. A couple quick reminders. We are definitely on a go with Fiona Hill on April the 8th. That's a Thursday as well. That'll be at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, as per usual. All details coming on that, but we've got the final sort of green light for that just last night. Stay tuned. Next week, of course, we will also be in the midst of our Russia disruption series, where we will feature Andrei Sigankov, who is a professor at San Francisco State University, and he's going to bring us up to date on U.S.-Russia relations. Then the week following, we have a special program through the World Food Program, and we're going to be looking at food security and insecurity in Central America. And we have a number of really interesting speakers lined up for that panel. That's on April 1st. And of course, the big one, our gala on April 21st. Tickets just went on sale yesterday, where you get the fantastic opportunity to come and ask one of the, and this is my opinion, but one of the biggest figures in American political history over the last number of years, former FBI Director Jim Comey, and he'll be in conversation with Valerie Plame. And this is, as always, our big fundraiser for our global education programs in area high schools. So be sure to come on out and see an amazing speaker, but more importantly, support our amazing students and open an incredible window to the world that we uniquely can do for them. So that's Wednesday, April 21st. We have all kinds of other goodies coming your way, but our Russia disruption series is really taking shape. We also have on May 19th, Jamie Firestone confirmed, and he, of course, was a big-time lawyer and activist in Russia, working with Sergei Magnitsky and Bill Browder and others, and he has a lot to say about the situation in Russia today. So lots coming. We look forward to seeing you for all those programs. And with that now all out of the way, I would love to bring in today's speakers. And in a slightly different format than we normally do, I'm just going to introduce today's moderator, and he will take the floor. And moderating today is Richard Silver. Richard Silver is a retired Foreign Service officer who's had a career spanning the globe, as many of you Foreign Service officers have. He is a member of CIR's Board of Directors. And Richard, delighted to have you here, and let me turn everything over to you now.
Thank you, Sandy. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here, and it's a delight to welcome to the CIR stage Steve Herman, who is the White House Bureau Chief for the Voice of America. His experience includes over 25 years in Asia, reporting from Tokyo, and as VOA correspondent and bureau chief in India, South Korea, and Thailand. Steve has reported from dozens of other countries and territories. In 2016, he served as VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent based at the State Department. Steve is one of the most active White House correspondents on social media, with 105,000 followers on Twitter and 142,000 followers on LinkedIn. So please find Steve and track him. You'll find his reporting incredibly informative. During the Trump administration, he was a regular participant in the White House media pooling system, questioning the president in the Oval Office, in the briefing room, on the South Lawn and airport tarmacs, as well as overseas news conferences. In fact, Steve traveled on dozens of Air Force One domestic and international flights, including the 45th president's final journey to Florida on his way departing from office. During the 2020 US presidential contest, Steve covered both the Republican incumbent's campaign as well as that of the Democratic challenger and eventual victor, Joe Biden. And so with that introduction, let me introduce a incredibly nice human being and a very effective journalist from the Voice of America, White House Bureau Chief, Steve Herman. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Sandy. I'm very honored to be with you all today, hearing that list of upcoming speakers. It's really an incredible roster, and I'm flattered to be speaking with you. I'm sorry we're not doing it in person. I would love to be in Santa Fe, and Richard's invited me and my wife out there for a future visit. So we'll take a post-vaccination COVID rain check on that and try to get out there as soon as we can. I actually grew up in Las Vegas, in the other Las Vegas, the one in Nevada, not New Mexico. And I love the desert Southwest, so always look for an excuse to get out your way. I'm going to pop a sort of an introductory video. Then I will breeze through a presentation here and want to leave ample time for Q&A. So without further ado, you should be seeing my screen now if everything's going correctly, and we'll show you a short video here.
VOA, telling America's story for 75 years. VOA exports America's most powerful product, freedom of speech. Accurate reporting, reliable reporting, balanced reporting. Content you can trust. A U.S. bureau you can partner with. VOA informs and inspires with unparalleled access. In parts of the world, information is scarce and oppression real.
Can you turn up the volume, Steve?
That says, we report the truth. VOA, sharing America's voice with the world.
Apologies if the volume was a little low on that. Maybe I'll have at the end, there's another video, and perhaps Sandy can play that one out and control the volume. So if you're not familiar with VOA as an American, that's not surprising. You are not the target audience. We are exclusively an external broadcaster, a part of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Two of those networks are 100% under the federal government. That's VOA and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, which has radio and TV Marti. And then you may have heard of Radio Free Europe, which has been around for many decades, Radio Free Asia. We have Radio Sawa and Al Hura TV in the Middle East, and the Open Technology Fund, which are surrogate networks and grantees. But are not, the people that work for them are not federal employees. So why were we created, Voice of America? During World War II, in response to the closed societies and war-torn countries, there was a need in the face of especially Nazi propaganda that was even coming into American living rooms on via shortwave radio, that there was a need definitely to counter that message into Europe. And even to this day, as you well know, there are lots of countries that limit or prohibit a free and independent press. That was especially the case during the Cold War, when there was this bipolar struggle between the West and Moscow, as well as China, for basic principles. And in recent years, of course, that is a battle which has reemerged in this post-Cold War environment. We have 47 language services now, including English and Learning English. VOA, for those of you who have traveled or might have known about it from past decades, you might think of it as a radio-only shortwave service. It's much more than that. In recent decades, we have television. We're on FM radio, AM radio in different countries, the web, streaming, mobile, with an audience somewhere approaching 300 million weekly. It is the largest U.S. international broadcaster. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. If you ever get to Washington post-COVID, there's a great tour at the Cohen Federal Building at noon, and you can see the facilities we have. It's really pretty impressive, even if you're not really in to broadcasting. But all you are obviously in this group are into international relations, and we obviously think we play a key part of U.S. public diplomacy. So please do drop by if you get the opportunity. We have transmitting stations still in different parts of the world to relay for legacy broadcasting, but VOA is very much digital and state of the art. Of course, being a government agency, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get things rolling, but I think we've done a pretty good job of keeping up with, if something new social media app pops up, such as a WhatsApp or Instagram, if our language services feel that there's a significant way to reach people using those apps, they're doing it. So you may hear a lot in this discussion about the VOA Charter, and it's definitely been in the news in the past year. We are under a mandate, even though we're part of the federal government, to serve as a consistently reliable and authoritative source of news, and to be accurate, objective, and comprehensive, and also to represent America, reflect different views of what's happening in the country. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Also, there is a firewall between us and the U.S. Agency for Global Media and whoever is above them. That also popped up in the news in the past year. And it requires us as journalists to develop content of the highest journalistic standards that is free of political interference. We have a number of journalism initiatives to really work to counter disinformation. I'm not directly involved in those, but here are some examples of what we're doing in that area. So you will not hear VOA as a rule on your local AM or FM radio stations, but there was an argument made some years ago that foreign governments were able to put their material onto radio and TV in the United States. But for example, the Somali community in Minnesota, which wanted to air our Horn of Africa service in their languages, could not air VOA. So the Smith-Mundt Act 1948 has been amended, and there are ways for us to disseminate our content in the United States, but we cannot go out and market it as such. We have journalists all around the world. We're on the front lines. I've been in conflict zones at the site of natural disasters, and we do lose, unfortunately, some of our journalists occasionally, especially due to them being targeted by authoritarian regimes. A VOA reporter on the ground in Burma, I think we've had one in the past couple of weeks that's been arrested, and another one that was shot by some pellets covering the demonstrations. So we do have areas of news coverage which tell America's story. We have people that focus on the refugee issue. We have an extremism watch desk, a press freedom desk, Silicon Valley Bureau talking about science and technology. Women's issues was a big initiative in the past couple of years. And please check out polygraph.info, where we have a really impressive countering disinformation program with an emphasis on what the Russians have been saying and doing. And we now have some joint ventures, especially with our sister broadcaster, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, 24/7 Russian programming. Now, you might ask, are people in Russia seeing it? It is difficult in Russia to see it, but what this is more directed at is the Russian language diaspora. I've been in Kyrgyzstan, countries like that, where basically they're just bombarded with Russian language television from Russia. So it's part of our effort to push back against the Russian language Russia narrative controlled by the Kremlin. And we have bureaus and reporters and technical people all around the world. And we also work with local broadcasters. For example, in Indonesia, you probably can go into any village and hear our Bahasa Indonesia programming on a local FM station and also on TV. So this is a map of our 3,500 affiliates. Now, some of those affiliates might only carry an occasional VOA program, and others may be carrying many hours of VOA programming daily. The audience has been growing. As I mentioned, we are on a digital first push, and the numbers are growing there, where radio has sort of leveled off, as well as television. But of course, just like in any other media, the future growth is in digital, and we are not ignoring that. What is really important to us, and I think very impressive, is that we're trusted by the audience, especially in an era where even in the United States, people aren't trusting the media. And so I find these numbers to be very, very impressive, especially in places like China, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, Russia, obviously, as I was mentioning, just overwhelming Kremlin content there. So that one is a bit of a challenge as we push back on that. Social media engagement increasing in recent years. VOA is active in English and other languages on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. As you can see, the views are increasing. And we do have some quality programming, news and otherwise, and we do occasionally win some awards as well. And 1942, the first broadcast, here was the promise we put out there. And these are words that 75 years plus later that we still take very, very seriously, no matter what the technology is like. Edward R. Murrow ran the U.S. Information Agency during the Kennedy administration. To be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. And to be credible, we must be truthful. And this is also something you will find very interesting in a media bias chart that was put together by an advertising agency. You can see top and middle is where any news organization wants to be. You'll see AP and Reuters up there, and you'll see VOA there as well as one which skews towards original fact reporting and middle of the road when it comes to any sort of political bias. That's you'll get this in an attachment that Sandy will send out to you with some more background on me as well. So a little bit about what I've been doing the past 4 years as the White House Bureau Chief. Of course, I was frequently in the briefing room asking questions almost daily of the press secretary. I would tend to focus on more geopolitical questions, where the front row reporters were, of course, usually asking about something domestic. Our seat during normal non-COVID times is in the fourth row on the right-hand side between Fox News Radio and National Journal. Right now, the briefing room is pretty sparse. I think there's only about 13 seats in there in a rotational system because of the COVID restrictions. Something else we would do before COVID is we would have administration officials go out to the North Lawn. Usually they were doing hits on Fox News. And then some of them were kind enough to stop and talk to us on the way back in. And hopefully we will be back to normal soon, where we can gather this close together without masks, but we're probably a few months at least from this scenario again. In normal times, this is what the VOA booth looks like in the basement of the White House, really where the swimming pool was during the Kennedy administration. Again, a pre-COVID look of how tightly together we were packed in there in our what's called a double wide, a 2-person booth. Right now, we only have 1 person in this booth at a time for obvious reasons, and neither my colleague nor I have been vaccinated yet. That's Peter Heinlein on the right. He's retired now. And my colleague is someone who came from our Indonesian service, Patsy Widakuswara, who is actually in the press briefing room right now for today's briefing. Out on the White House North Lawn outside the West Wing is what's called Pebble Beach, these tents. These are where the TV networks broadcast live from, and you'll see the White House in the background. VOA does share one of these tents, so we have the ability for me or another White House correspondent or people from our language services to do live shots or taped recordings from the White House North Lawn as well. During the Trump administration and during the Biden administration, as the radio pool reporter, I was frequently in the Oval Office gathering sound for all the other radio networks. There's me, if you look at the blue arrow, on what was I think the most surreal day during the Trump administration when we had Kanye West in there. He was cursing and pounding on the Resolute desk and came over and gave the president a hug, which was, I said, one of the more surreal scenes we saw during those 4 years in the White House, which was obviously a very unconventional administration. As Richard mentioned, I traveled frequently on Air Force One. We usually running to get onto the plane. The food on Air Force One is pretty decent, actually. It's U.S. Air Force food. A lot of times I did not get to eat on the shorter flights because I was so busy typing and writing stories and having to be prepared. It was inevitable if the president came back unannounced to the press cabin, I would have a full plate of food on the tray in front of me and have to figure out within a few seconds how to get rid of that tray. That's a video. I guess, Sandy, you can play out that video there. And I'll leave this up on the screen if you want to jot down my email address and my Twitter handle so that you can follow me or communicate in case we don't get to answer your questions. But Sandy, go ahead and roll if you've got that other video queued up.
I don't have the other video queued up.
Okay.
So why don't we just
let me, I'm not sure I can increase the volume, but let's see if
in that case, we can just
here it is. Okay.
We make a difference when we unmask terror, when we explain the impossible, when we confront an uncertain future, when we give voice to the voiceless. The difference is freedom of the press. We are the voice of America, where free press matters.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for the wonderful introduction to VOA. I think many of us don't appreciate just how absolutely widespread the reach of VOA is and how important it is to foreign audiences, obviously, since it's not broadcast here. I also really appreciate you sort of pulling up the skirt and showing us behind the screen to tradecraft in the White House. And I'd like to start with there a little bit about what has the change been like when you're in the briefing room, when you're working in the White House between the previous administration and this administration. Could you just give us some local texture about the change in how you do your tradecraft and what the experience is in relating to the White House?
Sure. I mean, our approach to it doesn't really differ in any administration. I think it's really important to emphasize that regardless of whether a Republican or a Democrat is in the White House and there are political appointees above us, we're doing our job exactly the same. I'm there to, as any other journalist, is to try to eke out information, to try to give additional insight, to try to pick at administration policies, pull the threads on them, see if it comes apart, see if the argument, the narrative that the administration is putting out holds the line. Yes, we also have a role to promote American values and to demonstrate the political discussions that are happening in the United States. And part of that is by being an objective journalist and being in the White House press briefing room. As you saw during the last administration, it did sometimes get confrontational with some of the journalists. There was definitely I wouldn't call it necessarily a clash of ideology, but more of a clash of personalities. There was grandstanding obviously going on by press secretaries, as well as some of the individual reporters who were looking for gotcha moments on television for their respective constituencies. There was there was a lot of messaging or attempts at messaging to go on. That's not how I approach my job when I'm in the press briefing room. I'm usually there asking questions on behalf of our more than 40 language services. So I might have a question about what's happening along the border between Russia and Ukraine. One question we've been consistently asking in recent days is about vaccine diplomacy. What does the United States think of Russia and China engaging in vaccine diplomacy? And is the United States going to share some of its vaccine stock with other countries? These are really, really important questions right now for many of our language services and our audiences around the world.
So from a tradecraft perspective, the public perception is that the previous administration had a very confrontational relationship with the press, and you just noted that maybe part of it was theater. So when you're working behind the scenes, did you find that the level of professionalism and cooperation when you're not in front of the cameras was pretty good between both administrations, or was the on-camera, off-camera relationship totally different between them?
Yeah, I think, you know, there were a lot more theatrics when the cameras were on than when they were not on. And behind the scenes, especially those of us who are in the rotational pool, we have a job to do on behalf of all of our colleagues. And the most important thing is about the logistics, getting access to the information, being sure we can ask our questions and then try to extract reasonable answers. I did have my disagreements with press secretaries in the previous administration. Sometimes I went back to their office and shared them privately. They called me into their office sometimes, didn't like something that, for example, I had put out on Twitter, and I would explain it and we would discuss it. That happens in any administration. I suspect that will be the case in this administration as well. I would say there were significant differences in the level of skill sets of press secretaries. Some are really fit for the job, some are not. And the ones who are really not good in that job, regardless of what administration it is, probably don't last in it a long time. And then you had the attitude, for example, of Kayleigh McEnany as press secretary, who decided not to do any briefings whatsoever. And I guess that's one way to avoid on-camera confrontations with the media. Obviously, the bulk of the media was very dissatisfied with that sort of approach.
Well, let's turn to some structural questions here. I note that VOA is part of the federal government, and you are by legacy tradition, a Foreign Service officer, which is why I know you from your time as South Asia Bureau Chief when you were in New Delhi and I was working in New Delhi. And I appreciate very much when you look at the VOA Charter, it says, quote, present the policies of the United States and foster responsible discussion and opinion of these policies. Now, when I was a press secretary or an embassy press attaché, we had a very clear represent the US government. And could you kind of parse out a little bit the difference between representing the policies of the United States or presenting them versus, like in my case, working at the beginning of the Trump administration, we had an incredibly difficult time because the president was saying things that we were really uncertain about from a foreign policy perspective. And so the way we managed that was to look at the comments of cabinet officials, responsible members of Congress, to look at what they would say that essentially reaffirmed the continuity of policy at a time when the previous president was raising questions. Would we stand by the NATO alliance? What would happen if Russia wanted to test our resolve along NATO's eastern flank? And it was incredibly difficult when I would go out and speak about press freedom. People would throw a presidential tweet in my face, and I would be kind of responding to what American values traditionally were, even though they seemed to be eroded, and I felt very compromised. So from a VOA perspective, how do you square the circle between presenting the policies of the United States and yet having that firewall that lets you be objective, even if your view may be critical of those policies?
Yeah, excellent and important question, Richard. And I'll divide it into two parts. One is what I'm doing at VOA is an element of Voice of America. And obviously, a free and open press are part of the values of the United States, and VOA with its reporting is demonstrating how that works in the United States. There are public affairs programs on VOA which can explore government policy, and editorials also run on VOA broadcasts and are put up on the website that more directly reflect the views of the United States government. And what I was doing is similar to what you mentioned. If the president or a press secretary or a member of the cabinet came out and said something quite controversial, my story would include other views from members of Congress, from think tank analysts, from former administration officials to balance it out. I've always felt it's important to show that the United States on policy is not monolithic. And just as, what's coming out now with the American Rescue Plan from the Democratic-controlled Congress and the Biden administration, there are those in Congress, Republicans, who have voted against it and don't like it and will put their views in our stories. So we're not out there just propagating, regurgitating press releases or quotes without any context that come out of any particular administration. Now, I do get some criticism on Twitter sometimes because I'm live tweeting a presidential press conference or a press briefing, and I'm putting quotes in real time. I try to explain to people that tweets are not news stories. We say that journalism is the first draft of history, and I say that tweets are the first draft of journalism. We will go back and put together a story based on all those tweets and more balance it out. So sometimes I think, with the social media, where there's so many attempts to spin things instantly or flood the zone, and there's a lot of trolling going on social media as well. Part of my job is just to present the facts and not put it as something out there that's just a press release or propaganda.
Great. So writing about the VOA in the Atlantic last summer, Ann Applebaum noted, and I quote, "In a world where airwaves are flooded with authoritarian disinformation, the effectiveness of American messaging depends on the perceived credibility and independence of the messengers. Anything that resembles Trump TV or even just old-fashioned propaganda will have neither. America's international broadcasters are an important part of the face we present to the world. Thanks to congressional negligence, presidential malice, and general indifference, that face has just gotten uglier. Of course, this was in mid last summer. How would you respond to the criticism that Anne Applebaum gave about the previous administration? And how would you describe the current situation, recognizing that you're a current active federal employee that could place limitations on how you speak about your employer?
Yeah, anybody who has criticized VOA or alleged political interference in our reporting, whether it was in the previous administration or the current administration, and I do hear that frequently, and I say, go look at the stories that we're doing, and then come back to me and point out where you feel that the stories have been unbalanced, or where you see that there's any indications of a political interference in our reporting. What happens at higher levels? There was obviously in the last administration changes in direction and statements made by the people that were brought in by the Trump administration about how they felt about how VOA was living up to its mission or wasn't, and wanted to make some changes. And some of that there was pushback because there was a feeling that there were potential violations of the firewall. I can tell you at my level that no one ever said to me, no editor, no executive, you cannot report this, or you have to report this, or you have to spin it a certain way. My background was as a reporter with the Associated Press. I have found the values of VOA journalism to be extremely similar to the ethics, integrity, and approach of the major wire services. And if I was ever, given some sort of ultimatum that I felt violated the charter or was a breach of the firewall, and I didn't have any other choice, then I would no longer report for VOA. And I'm sure many of my colleagues feel the same way as well. So the fact that we're doing our job the way we're doing it, I think is testament to the fact that these safeguards, the institutional safeguards that are in place, did hold.
Outstanding. So now, before we turn to audience questions, I'll just ask for a kind of a final global walk around, if you will. Since VOA was founded on the view of responding to disinformation and propaganda in areas where there was very weak media access, particularly in authoritarian regimes, could you kind of take a look at, say, Burma, North Korea, some other hotspots where maybe there isn't great media access, and we're now in a world where there's so many different ways to communicate. I think it's harder to fight disinformation. So could you speak a bit about VOA's roles in some of these hotspots and how you're trying to manage it, and just walk around the world?
Sure.
Whatever countries,
Yeah.
you feel.
Burma, I think North Korea are fantastic places to pull out. Burma, especially because of what's happening right now. And our Burmese language team is doing an incredible job. We have people on the ground that are literally putting their lives on the line. The audience for VOA in Burma on television and radio is huge and very influential. We have a very large audience there. And with a crackdown now on the domestic Burmese media, the role of VOA is even bigger and bigger as the days go on. North Korea is a bit of a different situation because we do not have people on the ground in North Korea. We still use old-fashioned technology like shortwave and medium wave radio to broadcast into North Korea nightly. I was in North Korea in 2016 for about 10 days. I spoke to people in the North Korean military who acknowledged that they listened to VOA daily. They seemed to have grudging respect for what we were doing, although some people were convinced that VOA is an instrument of the Central Intelligence Agency. They thought I was a CIA person. I'm sure there was nothing that I could say that would dissuade them of that. But we know that among the population, especially people in Pyongyang, that a substantial percentage of people listen to VOA and Radio Free Asia on a near daily basis. And that what we do is really, really important and is probably the most influential broadcaster beaming into North Korea. I talked a little bit about Russian language efforts. Chinese is another really important one. A lot of people use VPNs, virtual private networks, to get around the Great Firewall of China. We also beam in TV programming via satellite dishes. People watch that in China daily, as is also the case in Iran, where our Farsi language service is also quite influential there. And then throughout Africa, I would say that's one part of the world where VOA has a bigger and better footprint than BBC, for example. And my colleagues who have spent time in Africa tell me that VOA reporters are treated like rock stars in Africa. They're household figures. And it's definitely one place where I think that VOA has been a great success for many, many decades. Also, Venezuela is another hotspot right now, and VOA Noticias is really focused on broadcasting to Venezuela, and we have lots of Spanish language affiliates throughout the region as well, and we have reporters at the White House, State Department, broadcasting daily in Spanish.
Outstanding. Well, I once again can't thank you enough, Steve. There's questions from the audience, and let me kick it over to Andy to modulate or moderate the audience questions.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Steve. That was super interesting. A lot of questions from the audience. I want to start with something that's a little bit different than what we've been talking about, which is a question from one of our board members, Tom Johnson, and he asks, is jazz still an important and appreciated content on VOA?
Yeah, a great question. There's some thought that the jazz program on a VOA, which lasted for many years, had as much for bringing down the Iron Curtain as any other American institution. I don't think there's a regular jazz program. There are some music programs on VOA. I was just proposing recently that perhaps we should have a hip hop program these days. I would love for the jazz program as a jazz aficionado for that to come back. And I think as we look ahead, these are the sort of programs that might be coming back. You know, one of the challenges is I was joking with our new acting VOA director, Yolanda Lopez, who used to run the VOA News Center, which is where I'm at, the English language programming, that she now has 47 children with 47 language services, and they're all fighting over resources. So that's the question: is we have a finite amount of money to spend, which is taxpayer money. So, you know, we have people that's all they're dedicated to, is figuring out what is the most effective way to spend that money. But personally, I would love to have more jazz programming.
Me too. And I guess another sort of internal question is there a place for us to listen to VOA? Is this readily accessible on the internet, or is this something, I know we are not the audience, but can we access some of the reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. It's at voanews.com. There are streams you can find on the website there. There are also shortwave broadcasts as well, but we're not trying to make any special effort to disseminate our content within the United States or to Americans, because that's not the intended audience. But everything out there, including the programming to Africa in English, is available on the website. If you speak a foreign language and it's one of our languages, you can also check out those particular language websites under voanews.com. And most of that programming, I think, is also available on their websites as well.
Okay. A couple questions here about VOA under the Trump administration. And I know there's some areas that we're not going to dive into, but what have been some of the key lessons that have emerged for the VOA from VOA being in the news for tricky reasons during the Trump administration? Are things changed? Has the internal culture changed? Are there more of a firewall between VOA and government statements and priorities?
Well, I know that there has been some examination of this up on Capitol Hill, discussion. We were very encouraged by the bipartisan support that was expressed by key members in the House and Senate for VOA's mission and for the firewall and for the charter. When VOA started popping up into the headlines, the American taxpayers, those on the Hill, are among our stakeholders. And it was a very encouraging, and I would say a morale booster for the people in VOA to see that support. It was also expressed in newspaper editorials across the country and on social media. All of this, I think, in hindsight, has turned out to be a sort of a positive for VOA, because it really raised our profile domestically. We don't go out there and lobby people, unlike with other government agencies where there's some benefit, direct benefit, that the American people get from the Interior Department or the Treasury Department. That's not the case for VOA. It's more of an indirect, more subtle benefit, being a projection of American soft power, having a role in public diplomacy. Those are the benefits that the American people get from what we do. And it's, it's a little bit more difficult to understand and perhaps subtle. So the profile of that, I think, was raised by all the publicity that VOA did receive in the past 8 to 10 months.
Is there an argument to be made, and I'm thinking of the U.S. Post Service as being, or Postal Service as being a relative analog here, is there an argument to be made that the head of VOA should not be a political appointee, should go through different paces in order to maintain the distinction between a political agenda and truth ultimately?
Well, that's above my pay grade. I we'll leave that to the think tank people, analysts, and experts about public diplomacy to debate. I will point out that there has been an argument about the structure of VOA, what was the Broadcasting Board of Governors after we were pulled out of U.S. Information Agency. Now it's called the U.S. Agency for Global Media. I like to say, as someone who wrote my master's degree thesis about the history of VOA and public diplomacy and countering the Chinese propaganda, there's been a struggle for the soul of VOA since the end of World War II, when there was a big discussion on Capitol Hill and elsewhere about what would be the role of government in broadcasting. And that did lead to the Smith-Mundt Act. There were people who felt uncomfortable about the government being in the broadcasting business. They wanted to make sure that the government would not be targeting Americans through any sort of broadcast institution. There were commercial broadcasters that were nervous about it, so they wanted to make sure that there were those protections in there as well. So that did lead to the Smith-Mundt Act. If you want to know more about this history, there is a book about VOA that one of our former acting directors wrote. His name is Alan Heil Jr., Heil. So I would recommend getting that book from your library or ordering it. And there's a few other books out there that have examined the history of VOA, but that's usually the one that I go to. I think it's spelled Heil. Yeah, Alan Heil.
Got it. Perfect. Well, staying with this, sort of commitment to truth question from Herb Thomas here. He says, I remember vaguely that people in the State Department believed that the VOA Amharic service had been taken over by a cabal of Amharic speakers who were pushing a particular political slant in their coverage, most likely of the Ethiopia-Eritrea war. I'd heard similar complaints about other VOA services, possibly the Somali service. Is that accurate? Do things like that still happen in the sense that regional biases might creep into VOA reporting?
Well, I have not obviously worked in the Horn of Africa service, and I don't speak any of the languages there. I do know that with certain language services, there have been allegations that either, at the same time I'll hear this language services is too sympathetic to the regime in power, and then I'll hear that that language service is not objective at all, that it's too hostile to the regime in power. So I would leave that to people who actually speak those languages. I'm always open to reading any sort of analyses that are made, and we at the top, not me personally, do program reviews who do look for biases in the programming. And usually, look, this stuff is all out on the air. If there's a serious problem, it's going to pop out into a public venue. And this is something internally that I can tell you that the bosses would take very, very seriously and would examine and do examine the content to make sure that these sort of problems are not happening.
Right, and removing bias or even being aware of bias is extremely difficult and something that every journalist has to constantly struggle with and revise and revisit and so on. Let's fly up from the Horn of Africa over to Saudi Arabia, American ally much in the news these days. Paula Woolworth asks, she's noticed there's no affiliates, no VOA affiliates in Saudi Arabia. Was there ever one pre-MBS? Are there any efforts to gain a relationship there? Talk to us about Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that. My observation is the media is pretty tightly controlled inside Saudi Arabia, but what I do know about that region is that most people have satellite dishes, and so they can easily consume the content of Al Hurra TV. VOA does not have an Arabic language service anymore. Arabic was shut down at VOA and put under something called the Middle East Broadcasting Network. So it's Radio Sawa and the Al Hurra television service. And I know that they do have a significant audience within Saudi Arabia where people are watching it via satellite television.
Okay. Good to know. There's a comment here I want to just read, and it's from Virginia McCallum saying that she was with a visiting scholar from Romania, and he had commented how the Voice of America had been a lifeline for him and other scientists during the Cold War, and she was struck by how the VOA was on his mind nearly 30 years after the end of the Cold War. And he told me that the VOA continues to be the news most respected and trusted in Romania. And I think that's just a lovely, comment and point about the role that the VOA can play in countries abroad, especially in those countries that don't necessarily have the same kind of access to media that we have here. I'm assuming that the plans to continue to penetrate countries that don't necessarily have an open environment, remains, and we'll keep going.
Yeah, what I do know is that our language services are not cast in stone. They wax and wane over the decades, depending on the mission. It's always being re-examined to see if they're in line with the strategic priorities of the United States. For example, Japanese was sunsetted in 1964, I believe. There is somewhere on the voanews.com website a history of all the language services, and you can see there are some that have gone and come back. And I do know a colleague of mine, one time, Fred Cooper, who had been in Hong Kong, had the mission to stand up again Somali language service within a 90-day period when there was a renewed crisis there. So we will act fast. Sometimes we do launch new language services. There was a particular service set up, I think, within the past few years, specifically for the Rohingya along, in that region of Bangladesh and Burma. And I know Democratic Republic of Congo has been a particular focus recently, and there are some new language services that have started up in Africa. And then people will look and say, well, we don't need to serve this particular region. In recent years, I know the Hindi service was shut down, but we still do Bangla, we still do Pashto, we still do Dari, and we still do Urdu. We don't do Nepali, and we don't have Tamil anymore as well. So, and I think between VOA, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Al Hura, Radio Sawa, and the BBC, that most of the strategic languages in the world do have some sort of credible external broadcaster to get the news, which is very encouraging.
Well, and that's a great segue to a question here from Irene Thomas. She asks, are your reporters generally native speakers recruited by VOA or American polyglots or both?
Well, for those with the language services, I think almost without exception, they are native speakers of those languages. They have to have broadcast quality delivery for what they're doing on the air in those languages. As Richard and others will know from language training, it's one thing to go to get some professional training from the State Department, to be sent out to your post so that you can communicate with people who want to get visas or engage in some bilateral meetings. It's quite another thing to be able to do an interview or broadcast in a foreign language, especially the more difficult languages. And I know within the State Department, those diplomats who can go on the air and do interviews in say, Arabic or Mandarin are highly prized. Some of our broadcasters are bilingual. My colleague on the White House beat right now, Patsy Widakuswara, for example, is a native Bahasa Indonesia speaker who came to the United States at the age of 12. She broadcasts in English, and she also broadcasts back to Indonesia in her native language as well. And Nike Ching, who is one of our State Department correspondents, writes in English and also is a fluent native Mandarin speaker, being from Taiwan. So those are a couple of examples I can think of my colleagues in the central newsroom. And there are a few in the language services as well who can also come on the air in English if need be, when there is a big story happening on their beat or in their country as well.
Couple questions about the Trump administration, and then we'll sign off. The Trump administration was much in the news for some difficult or some challenging things, or a spotlight being put onto it as an administration in terms of how it functioned didn't function. How did the VOA approach that kind of storytelling? Would it send stories about, for example, the Trump administration to every country equally, or would there be differences? Or how was that sort of internal reporting broadcast out to the world?
Yeah, during the Trump administration, and as is the case with the Biden administration, nothing has changed about how we internally distribute our stories. For example, if I write a story or put together a radio or a TV piece in Central News, um, that story will go out to all of our 47 language services. They can decide if they're going to pick it up. Maybe they want to edit down, add some of their own context. But my intention when I write a story is that it could be used as is by the other language services.
Okay. And then, newsrooms across the country have both breathed a sigh of relief that the Trump administration has, gone into the history books, given how aggressive they could be about the news or the fake news or whatever we want to call it, and yet on the other hand, have been struggling to replace the clicks that people were doing. How has VOA gone about this transition from Trump to Biden? You said before that there were not many major differences. Have there been any notes of transition from one administration to the next, or is it really just business as normal?
Well, the leadership has changed. There is an acting VOA director in place. There is an acting director of the U.S. Agency for Global Media who is in place, Kelu Chao, who came from the Voice of America. So that has structurally changed. We have been directed by our bosses to follow the charter, and they are being mindful of the firewall. So those are obviously major significant changes, and in every change of administration, the president has the power to appoint the new directors for VOA, and now under this structure for U.S. Agency for Global Media. There's also been some changes, which is pretty wonky, about the oversight boards. The Broadcasting Board of Governors was an actual part-time board, and one of the things that happened in the Obama administration was to change the structure to create an all-powerful chief executive officer for the U.S. Agency for Global Media. And John Lansing was brought into that role. He's now the CEO of National Public Radio. So as I mentioned, there is always discussion, debate up on Capitol Hill about what the oversight structure will look like. That does not affect my day-to-day job. I very much do the job the same as I did over all of the administrations that I've been associated with VOA, as a freelancer, a contractor, and as a staff correspondent.
One last question for me before I turn it back to Richard for last word. You've been at VOA for a while. When you look forward down the road, what kind of optimism do you have for VOA or for an American voice abroad, or for American soft diplomacy abroad? What are you most optimistic about?
Well, as a bit of a scholar on soft power and public diplomacy, and as someone who has worked for VOA for a number of years now, I'm very bullish on the mission, on what we do. And I also have more confidence than I did some years ago that what we do is valued by our stakeholders, and to see in such a politically divisive atmosphere in the United States that we do enjoy strong support on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill is very, very encouraging. And I think that there's a mandate for us in the field to keep doing our jobs to the best of our ability, to uphold our values, to follow the charter, so that we can maintain the trust that our stakeholders have what we do. But of course, we'd love to have more language services, more correspondence, and that requires a bigger budget. So I'm hopeful that those who control the purse strings who create the budgets and who approve the budgets on Capitol Hill will give us more money so we can do an even better job.
I couldn't agree more. Richard, let me turn it over to you for the final word.
Well, there's only really one final word, which is gratitude to Steve. And if I can, in exchange, in extending my gratitude, also make a few comments about your slides, specifically when it showed how trusted the VOA is across so many countries. I know that now that we are in a new administration focused on restoring our international alliances and rebuilding the notion of shared values in a broader global community, knowing that the trusted voice of VOA is still being well received gives me great hope that we have a strong foundation upon which to build. So thank you again, Steve, for allowing us to understand the reach of VOA, the trust that VOA enjoys, and the optimism that you share for a future of shared global values. And with that, I give enormous thanks to the audience. Without you, we wouldn't be here. And I also thank you, Sandy and Steve. And with that, have a lovely day.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoyed it. And reach out to me at my email or on Twitter if you have additional questions.
Thank you so much, Steve. Greatly appreciated. Best of luck to you. And for all of you out there, look forward to seeing you next week when we get back into our Russia disruption series. And until then, have a great day.